Hey, welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Dan Shapir,
Hey from Tel Aviv.
now in Technicolor.
Yeah.
He just got a new computer with a new camera. So
Exactly.
pretty.
Yeah,
We also
so
have Steve
pretty.
Edwards.
Hello from the warm desert area of Arizona.
Nice. I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. I just got back from Amsterdam. We have a special guest this week, and that is Josh Goldberg. Josh, you want to introduce yourself? I don't know if we've had you on before.
Yeah, I don't know if you have. But hi, I'm Josh. I work in open source full-time, mostly in the TypeScript ecosystem. I was actually just in Amsterdam right before Chuck, and then in Timișoara, Romania. So I'm glad to be back home in Philly. I'm tired.
Oh, Timișoara is lovely.
Nice.
Yeah.
Amsterdam is also lovely, but yeah, that's obvious.
Yeah, had a good time. I was there for Rails World. I don't know what you were there for, Josh.
React Live, and then prior to that, JSJ IE in Dublin. So I'm
Oh, yeah.
post-conferencing right now.
I
Wow.
think I might have already watched your talk from there.
Great.
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm confusing it with some other talk. It seems a bit, quick for the talk to be up already. I'll need to check.
Yeah. So anyway, the story here is basically that I figured out that I wasn't checking the DMs on the JavaScript Jabber Twitter account. And Josh had told me about interesting stuff that he was doing on that same account. And so I got on, and it had been a few months, and I was like, no, this is cool. We should get you on. So Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, you're talking to us about what is it? It's the TypeScript ESLint something, right? Am I in the right ballpark?
You are, yes. I like hearing people suffer and struggle with our naming, but yes, it's TypeScript ESLint, the tooling that allows you to run ESLint and prettier and similar TypeScript code.
I should have just confidently said that, but I didn't.
Can we slightly digress before we go there? Because you mentioned right up front that you're 100% into open source. And I'm really curious about how, what's it like? How are you making this work?
It's very scattered, but I really enjoy it a lot. And it's less different from my old full-time jobs than I would have thought. Instead of working on tooling projects, work in general for a specific company or a set of companies, like when I was doing consulting, instead I work on GitHub projects, which may or may not have other people working on them or even using them. So my day-to-day is a lot of going to my GitHub notifications, blazing through a bunch of issues and pull requests, doing dev marketing and DevRel on Twitter and so on. The money is not nearly as good, but I really, really, really like what I do. And I think I have a positive impact on the world and community, I think. So I'm having a great time.
And where is the money coming from, if I might ask?
A little bit from GitHub sponsors. I have a personal sponsors page. TypeScript ESLint itself has an open collective, which is quite a bit more money than my personal. Once in a while, I'll dip into consulting if I start to worry about the money. And then also I wrote the Learning TypeScript book from O'Reilly. So that gives me monthly royalties too.
Oh, that's really cool. An author. Published author.
Yes, a lot of people reference books on TypeScript, and it's nice. I think mine is currently the main one that people use to get into it if they haven't written any TypeScript or any other language beyond JavaScript before. So I'm very proud of that.
I'm curious, are you teaching TypeScript to people that you assume already know JavaScript, or is it teaching TypeScript as a whole new language?
It's the former, yeah. I assume you have some level of JavaScript. It doesn't have to be super advanced. You don't need to know things like symbols and disposables. But pardon me, the new using syntax. The art of teaching TypeScript is much trickier if the person doesn't already know JavaScript. I think it's possible to write a book that teaches both, but it's much quicker and I think more clean to assume a bit of JavaScript first, because that's how TypeScript works. It builds on top of JavaScript instead of replacing it.
So if someone were to ask you, basically, let's say, I want to get into front-end software development, I don't know any programming, I want to do it myself, not going to a boot camp, whatever, would you recommend to them to first learn JavaScript and then learn TypeScript?
That is my kind of default starting recommendation. I have worked with people who just went into TypeScript first. It's not an impossible path. There's a Twitch streamer, Jen Junod, who is going through my book now with me, and she knew no JavaScript beforehand. But for the most part, I really recommend people try to learn one thing or area of things at a time. In this case, learn a programming language, learn the concept of for loops, if statements, functions, and so on, and then also add on the concept of a type system on top. That being said, TypeScript is really useful for people who are learning to code because it gives you a lot of really nice hints and suggestions and tooling before your code crashes annoyingly. So it's not a one size fits all. I just have a general starting recommendation.
Yeah, it's interesting that when my son studied computer science in university, he's just wrapping up his studies, by the way. They first learned Python as the language for the 101 CS class, and then they moved on into Java to learn about types.
Hmm.
So in a way, they kind of match that sequence that you're describing. And also, out of curiosity, you mentioned like multiple open source projects, so it's not just TypeScript ESLint; it's other projects as well.
Yeah, but TypeScript ESLint is the main one. I have been working for the last year or so on originally called Template TypeScript Node Package, now the slightly less annoying name of Create TypeScript App, which is a good default starter that can also set up a lot of really good tooling. At time of recording, I am about 2 weeks overdue for some commitments I'd made to the ESLint project itself. Sorry, Nicholas and everyone else who is waiting and probably impatient with me. But for the most part, it's a few big projects, mainly TypeScript ESLint, and then a lot of really small utilities that I've written or joined on that most other people wouldn't have used or heard of.
So if we're moving back to the main topic of discussion, which is TypeScript ESLint, and you mentioned that you also work on the ESLint project, I guess that means that these two projects are distinct. Can you both describe what TypeScript ESLint is and how it relates to ESLint?
ESLint is a project that is the standard JavaScript linter these days. There are other linters out there, but ESLint is the most popular and well-known one by far. In my personal headcanon and terminology, a linter is a tool that runs a set of discrete checks in your source code, or rules. Each of those rules checks for one specific issue, such as an unused variable, and then may optionally provide auto fixes or suggestions for how to fix if and when it finds complaints. ESLint is really extensible, configurable, pluggable, whatever you want to call it. There are a bajillion plugins out there, things for personal style conventions, framework-specific rules. For example, React's plugin rules. React rules of hooks are a very popular plugin. But ESLint just works on JavaScript, natively at least. You can add in different parsers, but by default, ESLint only understands core JavaScript syntax. One of the very popular, in fact, the most popular parser, I believe, is the TypeScript parser, which is one of the packages we in the TypeScript ESLint project provide, which, as you said, yes, is a separate project, different GitHub org, different governance, different set of maintainers. I'm a core maintainer on TypeScript ESLint, and just so happen to have committed a few times to ESLint itself. So we're very much separate projects. We're not enemies in any way. It's not like we intend to be separate. It's just that they have very different needs as projects, and TypeScript ESLint actually is much more recent than ESLint itself. Back in the day in the TypeScript community, we had a separate project called TSLint, which was a completely separate implementation of a linter written solely for TypeScript in TypeScript. And thank heavens, we have deleted all that duplicate code and aligned on using ESLint with extensibility options such as a new parser for TypeScript code.
So TypeScript ESLint takes ESLint, builds on top of it, and extends it to support TypeScript beyond JavaScript, correct? So it's not like a completely, it's a distinct project in the sense that you're working on a separate like repo, but it's not distinct in the sense that the two do work together.
Yes. My only caution with the phrasing there is that we are a parser and a plugin, just like many other parsers and plugins are. For example, there's a plugin that provides you rules for React code specifically, and we are a plugin, among other things, that provides rules for TypeScript code specifically. There are other parsers, and we are a parser. So you're still running ESLint. You still do npx ESLint dot or similar. It's just your ESLint config. If you want to work on TypeScript code, will generally include references to the TypeScript ESLint parser and plugin.
So if you were to use this, if you're using TypeScript in a project, then you're only using this instead of the standard ESLint when you're installing?
No, you're using the standard ESLint, but you're
But I
telling
mean, do you
ESLint
need to download that as well as your project, or does your project take care of that in terms of dependencies?
we don't have any fancy schmancy initializer that wraps around ESLint or does that. You have to install and configure ESLint and then also install and configure us. By the way, I realize this is very annoying and cumbersome to listen to, let alone to do on your computer. No one is thrilled that this is the state of the art, and the ESLint team is working on a long-term overhaul that'll make all this stuff easier. But for now, what I've just described is somewhat the current state of things.
So before we go too much farther, could we, for those that might be uninitiated, could we describe what a linter is? Um, just to clarify, it is not the stuff that you pull out of your dryer that clogs up your dryer. That's a different kind of lint. I think my thought of a linter definition is basically something that helps you format and make your code nice and neat. Is that a proper way to say it? That's more of a prettier, or maybe a linter is just sort of to catch some errors and things like that. How would you define a linter? I mean, I know what it is, but I can't describe it, I guess.
Sure. You've activated my trap card. One of the big tirades I've been going on and saying at conferences is that there were three really common forms of static analysis in the web space today: linting, formatting, and type checking. I would say that the three are distinct and one should use different tools for each of them, even if the CLI or wrapper is the same. Just the three are separate implementations. A formatter is a tool that looks at your source code and completely reformats it, messes with your semicolons and tabs and spaces and new lines, all that. Now, a formatter is able to be very quick and should be super simple because all it does is reformat your code. It doesn't change your logic. It doesn't catch bugs. By simple, I mean from the user side. It's actually rather complex to write a formatter, very difficult on the inside. But that is completely separate from the concept of a linter, which runs a set of discrete checks that look for, say, logical issues or stylistic inconsistencies. And fun fact, ESLint has rules that can catch formatting concerns, and it has had them for quite a while. And part of the reason why is that when it first came out, there was no prettier. There's actually a research paper that had to be published for people to figure out how to write a thing like prettier first. But now, ESLint has decided they're going to deprecate the core formatting rules. They're being moved to a separate community authored plugin so that ESLint core just deals with logical issues and the occasional stylistic. Does that answer what you were looking for?
And you did give before several examples of some of the issues that the linter might catch. I'll give a few more. For example, using let when you should be using const, not using the same variable in an internal and external scope. Unreachable code potentially. Let's see if I can think of some more off the top of my head. If the variable naming, like for example, you're using not camel case but something else. You should be using Pascal case for classes and camel case for variables. If you're not doing that, are there other examples that I'm missing that are really common?
Yeah. But before I give my wanna note, you bring up a really interesting point that those are a lot of those are stylistic concerns, and developers tend to get a little rough when we try to force stylistic concerns on them. So a lot of the linter maintainers, such as myself, have been working a little bit less on style things and a little bit more on logical things like catching bugs. That's not to say they're not valid. In my create TypeScript app repo, I have lint rules that sort everything for me and do all sorts of style stuff. It's just really hard to get that in a way that people like. But one of the big advantages of TypeScript ESLint, running ESLint on TypeScript code, is that if you're using a TypeScript code base, you're able to assume that you can use TypeScript's type information. So you can write lint rules that use type information to make really, really intelligent, sharp deductions on your code. For example, my favorite rule is no floating promises, which says if you do something that creates a promise, that promise needs to be handled in some way. It can't just float off into the distance and potentially unhandled process exception crash. It needs to be awaited or have a .catch or be passed to a variable or something. We also have a rule that detects an unnecessary await. So if you do something like await some function call, but that function isn't an async function and doesn't return the promise, then you could probably just remove that await. TBD.
Yeah, it's important to note that it's perfectly legal JavaScript code, that it will work. It will effectively wrap the result in the promise, as I recall. But But like you said, it's effectively pretty useless and probably not what you intended. It's likely the result of some refactoring that somebody forgot to take it all the way.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the big benefits of a linter or using a lot of linter rules the way I do is that when you refactor and you have stuff that's left over, it can catch a lot of those little excess things that might have been okay when they were first written, but because of your refactoring are no longer particularly valuable. So in a sense, one of the many purposes of a linter can be to help you refactor your code and get a little more confidence in your rewrites.
How about too long or too complex functions? Where would you put that?
Ooh, probably
Those are
pull
the ones
request
I
review.
hate, by the way.
Oh yeah, if you hate a lint rule, that's a sign that that lint rule shouldn't be enabled on your code base.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
sure.
there's a difference between having an opinion and then wanting that opinion to be enforced by a particular part of your dev process. I personally really like small, not tiny, but relatively small files, functions, and so on. But it's roughly impossible to make a lint rule that can delineate a fine line and exact, this is the cutoff. 100 lines, that's where I draw the line. So I'd say maybe push that into like a soft guidance note in your team documentation and ask people to check it in code review.
I'd probably look the rules that I value the rule that I value the most is consistency. So I probably have like an inverse type process where the tool first analyzes the existing code base, figures out the
Mm,
rules that match that existing code base, and then enforces them going forward.
that's really interesting. This feels like it's better suited for tooling that is not based on hard measurements, but on vibes, on general soft thoughts. So actually, I really hate to bring up AI because we're talking about tooling that is not a good fit for AI. But yeah, like the human part of things, what you just described, I think is where I'd put that concern.
It's like I see some code. I'm one of those people that prefers functions, the function keywords for named functions. But I see a lot of code bases where people use arrow functions for named functions as well. So they would have like const x equals an arrow function, and that's the way they declare functions. And even though I dislike this approach, if that's the way the code base is written, that's how I will write my code. So because otherwise you're bringing up, somebody who reads the code later on starts asking themselves, why is this code written differently than the rest of the code? Does it indicate some uh, behavioral or functional difference that often doesn't actually exist, and so forth? So consistency is the number one concern. So a rule like that, like looking at the code base, figuring out that code base like mostly uses arrows for named functions and then enforces that going forward. That would be cool in my book, but I digress.
Well, in some of the linters I've used in other languages, that's effectively what they do. And so when they enforce it, though, they have the option to fix it, right? Which
Yeah.
is a formatter, not a linter, according to what Josh is telling us.
Well, it's a very difficult line to delineate. In theory,
Right.
formatters would only do things that don't change your AST or abstract syntax tree, the representation of what is actually in your code file. But there are some concerns that do have a different AST, such as a named function versus an arrow function versus and so on. But like they don't really change your code. So if you look at the code and it doesn't use any of the features that would care about which one you used, you could probably fix it. But
Yeah,
Mhm.
generally, it's hard.
that could be really challenging to figure out in some cases because the hoisting rules, for example, are different, and it might be really tricky to make sure that you're not introducing bugs
Yeah,
if you try to automatically reformat the code in that way.
yeah. ESLint rules can alternately either or both of fix and suggest. They can provide a fix that is safe. It is
Mhm.
marked as unless we have a bug, this is okay to dash dash fix automatically. They can also provide suggestions, like the unnecessary await rule I mentioned will provide a suggestion for removing the awaits, but it won't actually automatically do that. It's not a dash dash
Right.
fix because that actually does change your code slightly, and maybe you had a reliance on that extra process tick from the unnecessary await, and fixing it would actually destroy your entire application. Who knows?
I have to ask though, given that, well, AJ likes to say, who's not here on the show today, unfortunately, likes to say that TypeScript is a superset of a subset of JavaScript. But effectively, it is in most cases a superset. Why not just use TypeScript ESLint? Why do I even need ESLint? I mean, why don't I treat everything as being TypeScript, sometimes with missing types?
Ooh, great question.
Especially, by the way, if I'm using, let's say, JSdoc inside JS files.
Great question. So we had that. That's what TSLint was. I was a maintainer, not a creator, but a maintainer on TSLint. But the problem then was that you have a lot of people who still do write JavaScript without TypeScript, and a lot of tooling built on JavaScript, not TypeScript. Because JavaScript is an open standard, ignoring the fact that some company happens to open the trademark, so we have to call it ECMAScript. JavaScript is the thing that runs in browsers. Whereas TypeScript is one example of how one might extend JavaScript. It is not a standard. It's owned by Microsoft. Fun fact, did you know Microsoft used to have a not stellar reputation among developers? I blows my mind. So we
Back in
really
the good
don't
old
want to.
days.
Yeah,
Been
long
there,
ago.
done that.
Yeah, I don't.
I am
Embrace, extend,
shocked.
extinguish.
Shocked.
Yeah, so even if Microsoft was perfect, if every developer at the company was as wholesome and wonderful and smart as Satya Nadella, their current CEO, who people tend to like, myself included, it's still a specific company's thing. So we don't want to build tooling that forces everyone to be writing one company's specific language. In fact, I'm looking forward to competitors to TypeScript because TypeScript is a decade plus old project and it has limitations as a result of that age. And I look forward to the next round of cool stuff we can do. But anyway, I digress. Yes, we used to have TSLint, and then because we still needed the stuff to work on standard native JavaScript, you'd have two implementations of everything. Two implementations of your linter, two implementations when we added rule fixers, two implementations of the React rules of hooks, the ESLint plugin and TSLint for React. It was a pain in the butt. So now we've duplicated a lot of the code, and if they ever diverge, it makes it harder to swap back and forth between if you convert to or from TypeScript and JavaScript. And before you ask, why would you ever convert from TypeScript to JavaScript? Well, that happens once in a while.
DHH for the win.
Yeah.
Also, to an extent, SvelteKit, although the story there is very
Svelte
different.
also, yeah.
Svelte.
So that's a whole other topic. SvelteKit, they're still using TypeScript. They're just using a different syntax for the types.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and they still support it on the front end if the users want to use it. It was just in their core that they made the changes.
Yeah. I would even say almost every JavaScript developer today, even if they never touch TypeScript, is still benefiting from the language because it's built into editors such as VS Code.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm a Vue user myself. I do the Vues on Vue podcast, and Vue 3 was all written in TypeScript from the ground up.
No, but it's beyond that. It's the browser DOM, the Node APIs, Express, whatever. They all come with TypeScript bindings these days. So, and the type definition files, and you're benefiting from TypeScript even if you're not using TypeScript at all. Like when that whole kerfuffle, on the Twitter Spaces, X, whatever happened, I kind of shit tweeted that my ideal development environment is I'm doing JavaScript and every other developer in the world does TypeScript. Because then I get the total freedom and everybody else has to, provides me with all the type information that I might need.
That's really funny. I like that. I'm sure the reactions you got were polite. But anyway, you asked a question. Sorry, I keep getting excited and distracted. So we had that. It was a pain in the butt. Now we deduplicated. So it's the ESLint core and other languages such as TypeScript can be added on. It can be plugged in with stuff such as TypeScript ESLint. You can use TypeScript ESLint on ESLint code. It's just we provide a lot of niceties that get added in if you have type information enabled on your code base.
By the way, again, as an aside, do you have an opinion on the type specifications proposal for ECMAScript?
I do. I think you can probably guess what that opinion is based on the giant grin on my face. I'm really excited about it. I think that the proposal
type
is really
annotations.
smart.
That's the phrase. Type annotations. Not
Sure.
what I said before.
It's all the same to me. The general idea is the syntax or annotations, they essentially glorified comment is something that will be built into JavaScript. So there will be less difference between what you write in TypeScript land, write in JavaScript, or run in JavaScript land. But the concept of a type checker is still up to the developer. So TypeScript or one of its competitors, so to speak, or future equivalents can still innovate in the type checking space and perhaps even type syntax space. But if we reach this nirvana in what will presumably be at least 5 to 10 years from now, likely more, where you can write code that has full TypeScript type declarations inside of it and not have to transpile it into something else to run it, that will be really nice. So I hope that's the world we're moving towards.
Cool. By the way, Gil Tayao was a guest on this podcast a while back, talking about ES modules. I think is one of the people, one of the proponents, and one of the people who proposed this to the ECMAScript DC39 committee. But going back to TypeScript ESLint, so can you mentioned like some of the rules that are kind of need the type information in order to be implemented, like the ones around await and the ones around promises, making sure that there's a catch for every promise. Um, can you give additional examples of like these kind of types, TypeScript specific rules that need type information in order to be enforced?
Yeah. And for the viewers who have access to any kind of show note or a search engine, we have it all documented on TypeScript ESLint.io. There's a dash in that name. There's kind of an interesting dichotomy between the two ways that I think about rules. There is the specific to TypeScript stuff, such as enforcing consistency of whether you use type or interface. That's one of those things where, again, the actual difference is very small. The real important thing, as you said, Dan, is consistency. And then there are rules that could apply to JavaScript and or TypeScript code, but need the TypeScript type information to work effectively. One of my favorite ones is the one that enforces that you write for loops in the correct way or correct syntax for arrays versus objects. Our rule no for in array says don't use the for I in syntax with an array because that actually iterates over the properties of the array and it has these weird edge
Right.
cases and it's not great. You want to use for of. But the only way to know whether the thing being iterated over in any particular line of code is an array is to use the type information. Because in theory, you could write this rule with just the single file in mind. But if it's like the result of a function that's been imported from somewhere else that imports from a node package, yada, 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 it's impossible to know what it actually would be unless you have the type info.
So here's an interesting thing that occurs to me, and correct me if I'm wrong. Seems to me that when applied to JavaScript, ESLint is very local. You look at the specific JavaScript code inside the function. When you're thinking about TypeScript, you're thinking about types of other functions and functions that might be declared in other files. And TypeScript doesn't have like in C like .h files or stuff like that. It's the actual source code of the file. So a change in one file could impact the correctness of lots of other files, something that doesn't exist in JavaScript that I can think of. Maybe it does. I can't think of when it might exist. Maybe stuff with dynamic imports, I don't know, or stuff like that, or not, or any imports like that you're importing something from a file and then you remove the export that maybe could impact that's a change, adding or removing an export that might be a change that impacts other files like with JavaScript. But other than that, I'm hard pressed to think of any case or scenario in JavaScript where changes in one file might impact the correctness of other files that you can check. But
Yes.
that's not the case for TypeScript if I'm thinking about it.
Yes. You've hit one of the focal points of my life pain here, that ESLint was originally designed assuming that the AST representation of a file, a single file, along with your configuration, is all you need to lint that file. That is no longer the case. There are quite a few pain points because ESLint was designed with one way in mind, and now we've gotten to this more complex way. ESLint's cache mechanism that it comes with doesn't understand the concept of one file changing might invalidate the cache for every single other file. And then, it's there are some performance implications of this that mean that running ESLint with type information in your editor and or on the CLI is not as fast as it could be because of the APIs that we and the parser land are given are a little restricted. I'm sorry, go
Before
ahead.
you delve into that, you mentioned a term that might be worth an explanation to some of our listeners at least, which is AST. Can you elaborate a little bit on what AST is and how that's being used by a tool like ESLint?
By the way, I really hate when I have a bad habit of mentioning a term, assuming everyone knows it, and then actually it's a thing 1% of people might know. So thank you for asking. An AST, or abstract syntax tree, sounds to me a little more intimidating than what it is. It is a representation of what's in your source code. And both TypeScriptLang.org and TypeScript ESLint.io have good little playgrounds that can show this. I really like the one in TypeScript ESLint.io/play. If you have, let's say, a variable, let name equals Josh, that would be represented as a kind of a JSON structure where you have a variable with a name and a value. And then that value is a string, and then that string has, and so on. And that's what a lot of tooling uses to reason about your code. If we, let's say, were to write a lint rule enforcing let over var, we might look at every variable declaration, see its child in the tree that is its kind, and check that the kind is, let's say, let versus var versus cond versus using. So that's what tools like ESLint and TypeScript ESLint rules are built on.
And the fact that it's a tree is because most code in most programming languages hierarchical. Like you've got a function, and in the function you've got blocks and statements, and in the state, and you've so you can go like a top-down kind of a way of building a representation of the entire code, and it's kind of the meaning of the code with the kind of the syntax being stripped out in effect.
Exactly, yeah. It's abstract. It doesn't ideally care about formatting, whatever the character indentation is, and it certainly does not care about your type information. It's just the tree describing what's in the syntax. Yes.
Cool.
So the way
Yeah, so ESLint, I guess, breaks down the code into an AST and then does what with it?
it passes that AST to rules. The rules then define a bunch of selectors, each of which run logic when they hit one of the pieces of that tree called a node. For example, let's say the rule that says no var has a selector for every variable declaration where the kind is var, and then the logic, roughly speaking, just reports using the ESLint context. Hey, you used a var. Don't do that, you silly goose. Now, rules can have options about how to report, and then that report might go to, let's say, an editor or a command line or some other service. But at the core, you have your AST parsing used by the parser. Then that parsed AST is passed to rules, and then rules can do whatever they want on whatever subsection of your code, of your tree.
And I guess that TypeScript ESLint needs to replace the parser that constructs the AST, because the AST for parse JavaScript is different than an AST for parse TypeScript. All the type information, etc., that needs to be stored in the tree.
Exactly. Yeah. Interestingly, similar to how TypeScript is, roughly speaking, a superset of JavaScript, the tree that our parser generates is, roughly speaking, a superset of the tree that ESLint's core parser generates. We would generate roughly the same tree given this just JavaScript code, but it might also have, let's say, an interface or a type annotation or something in there. So we do generate the same tree as ESLint core because core ESLint rules still need to work on TypeScript code. We don't want to have to re-implement everything for a different tree, which is why we don't actually just directly pass back the tree that TypeScript's APIs would generate. That's a different format. But there are core ESLint rules that kind of break when given TypeScript nodes. They don't really know what to do with them. So we do, in addition to swapping out the parser, have some rules that swap out ESLint's rules.
So the parsers are things that people write themselves, right? There are probably multiple parsers out there for JavaScript or for TypeScript, right? So are you using something that somebody else wrote, or did you actually have to write your own or modify one that was already out there?
It's one of the sillier things I've seen in open source. We call the TypeScript API to parse a code file or text. We get the TypeScript format AST out. We then have a recursive piece of logic that converts all those TypeScript nodes into the equivalent ESLint AST nodes,
Mhm.
and then
Oh,
we
God.
pass back the ESLint AST nodes. Does anyone want to guess why we have to do that?
Because their structure is slightly different.
Yes. And then also, TypeScript APIs don't know or care about ESLint. So if you want to use type checking, you have to get the corresponding TypeScript node for the ESLint node and pass that TypeScript node to the TypeScript type checker API.
But you do the type checking. Doesn't TypeScript just? Why
Right?
do you need to assume some of the onus of the TypeScript work? Why do you need to do the type checking rather
Yeah.
than have just TypeScript do the type checking?
Yeah. Now we're into that. They should be 3 different tools, right?
Well, 15 different tools at the end of the day. Yeah, so by default, no type checking is done. Type checking is slow. No one likes slow. By default, we just parse and pass back the nodes. It's also much easier, by the way, to just ask TypeScript to do all the fancy schmancy parsing. Code can get complex, so it's nice having TypeScript do it for us most of the way. But later on, a rule might be given the TypeScript ESLint AST, which is like the ESLint AST, but more, and then wants to know the type of a node. And in order to know the
Hmm.
type of a node, you then have to grab the corresponding TypeScript node and then pass that to the TypeScript type checker. So that's why we generate both trees and keep actually both trees in the parsed output, even though most rules mostly just use the ESLint AST. Ta-da!
Interesting.
How much work are you doing on the parser then versus I mean, you still have to parse the AST so that you can get the information you need from it to give people feedback, right? That you violated this rule. So how much of the work is on the parser? How much of it's on understanding and reading the AST? And how much of the work is then on giving people feedback?
I'd say because we're built as a set of ESLint extensions, plugins, and rules, and so on, it's actually not that much work for us to do most of that. ESLint manages the running the rule and having a VS Code extension that reruns and so on. And fortunately, because TypeScript only releases a new minor version every, let's say, 3 or 4 months, we just have to update our tooling for new TypeScript versions every 3 or 4 months. Most of our work either goes into user education, because for a while that was not very invested in our section of the community, or in rule maintenance, writing new rules, fixing bugs in rules, discussing with people what should be a rule versus, and so on.
How do you come up with new rules for TypeScript?
We have a public issue tracker. I would encourage anyone who has an idea for, wow, I wish the linter would catch this to, of course, first search for duplicates and other discussions, and then go on the issue tracker and perhaps file an issue. For the most part, we try not to get into stylistic battles. Like we won't enable, let's say, a rule that bans enums. That comes up a lot because TypeScript enums are this controversial feature and it's a whole thing. But we will try to figure out what are the rules that every code base would at the very least want to be able to configure and have. And then if that rule is something that you can make a standard suggestion on, let's say don't use var, it's pretty popular as a suggestion, then we could enable that rule in one of our preset recommended configs.
Yeah, but that's
So
really a JavaScript rule or ECMAScript rule rather than a TypeScript rule.
Sure, yeah. So we have a rule. You can only contribute or suggest a rule for us if it either needs type information to work, because we're the only standard linter plugin that's popular and has type information, or if it's specific to TypeScript. So like actually, yeah, the example I gave you, right, is like a little because that's really an ESLint
mhm.
rule. But there are some
so
ESLint rules that don't work well in TypeScript code because of bugs, so we do replace some of them with our own rules, and that I think is one of them.
so
Hmm.
with the enum rule, would you write the rule and then just not turn it on by default? Like would you
Um,
build it?
We wouldn't build it, but we would encourage someone to use our, I think, well-documented tooling on top of ESLint's well-documented tooling to write their own darn plugin and
Okay.
enable it on their projects. And I was wrong, by the way. We don't recreate the ESLint no var rule, but we do have rules like no var requires, which says don't require something using var what equals require parentheses. We would prefer like an ESM import.
And what is your like release process? What's your versioning like?
We release canaries whenever there's a new commit, but for the most part, people just use our Monday release of new version. So we use pretty frequently. We, over the last few months, have been kind of reacting to bugs and feature requests from a new major version that we released, which was V6. We generally save majors for changes to our preset configs, of which there are now, I believe, 6 popular ones: recommended, strict, and stylistic.
6. Wow,
Yeah.
that's a lot.
I need to catch my breath for this discussion. There's a good set of reasons, but it's a whole thing. So please give me a moment to compose myself before I tirade. But okay. So there's the recommended preset config. Every ESLint plugin, or almost every ESLint plugin, by convention exposes a preset list of rule enables, disables settings called recommended. Good. We, separately from recommended, have a superset that's recommended type checked. If you go through the extra effort of telling our parser about your type information, what your TS config looks like, or where to find it, then we can enable more powerful but also more slow rules for you. So that's 2 preset configs. In V6, we split out the stylistic recommendations because, as we've discussed earlier, developers don't like being told stylistic conventions that aren't for them. But we do have our stylistic recommendations, and some of them can be, I think, quite valuable for enforcing consistency. So that's 4: recommended, type checked, stylistic, type checked. We also have a lot of really
There's
good rules.
stylistic type check. There's stylistic
Yeah.
rules that require type information.
Yes.
That's interesting.
I'm just querying on our site because I don't remember off the top of our head. Oh, yeah. Prefer optional chain. Knowing whether something should be the question mark dot is, in theory, kind of a stylistic concern. It doesn't fix your bugs, but knowing whether it's safe to use an optional chain is a whole other thing. Also, prefer string that
Like
starts
it's
with.
not undefined, that you can't. It's okay. I understand what you're saying. The property might be undefined, but if the object itself is undefined, that's a problem.
Yeah. And then what if it's a string versus an empty string instead of like null? Or what if its type is string or null or undefined? And then what if someone changes the comparison and so on? It gets tricky. You're
Well,
starting, I see in your eyes, you're starting to understand how painful this is to try to make, opinions or force it on.
Well, look, to be honest, the problem is not so much the quote unquote pain of adding all the types. It's the quote unquote pain of also supporting the world that doesn't have types. I mean, if you're looking at other programming languages that where typing is the thing, that there is no untyped option, then their linters are often more strict, and
Yeah.
they're not complaining about the fact that everything is kind of doubled, because that's just the way it is.
Yeah. And those languages don't have flavors. There's just C#, which I will maintain is a beautiful language. Love C#. There's no, C#, but the way Microsoft interprets it, or there's no, ES next for C#. It's just the version you're running on.
Yeah, but effectively TypeScript has, like it or not, and whatever you said about Microsoft, it's effectively become the de facto standard for type JavaScript.
Yeah. Which is a little painful to me. I love TypeScript. I think it's fantastic. I'm obviously a big advocate of it, but it's a risk, not a bad thing necessarily, just a risk for a community to settle on one JavaScript variant or one JavaScript flavor. So
I think
I'm
also
always trying to
gonna-
make sure it's separate.
Isn't Microsoft like submitting it as a standard or something?
No.
I also want to
Interesting.
point out real quick, you said C#'s a beautiful language. We're talking about TypeScript, and Anders Heilsberg is actually the brain behind
Yeah.
both. So
Yeah. And it's funny because a lot of syntax in JavaScript today and TypeScript and C#, they all learn from each other. Every language learns from each other.
Yeah,
right? Like there's stuff
they all
in
do.
Ruby that informs JavaScript and vice versa.
Yeah. Ruby is a beautiful language. Just saying.
Sure.
Right. Anyway.
Every programming language is beautiful in its own way.
Everything
I'm
is
thinking
beautiful.
the white
in
space
its
language or
own
something.
way.
Oh yeah, white space. You know what? Well, white space is the only programming language you can write inside programs written in other programming languages.
Yeah. I used to work at Codecademy, and a couple of years we did language courses as April Fool's jokes, not pranks. They were real courses My first year we did it on lol code, which is like a meme language, and then the second year we did it on emoji code. And we actually exposed quite a few bugs in the platform, having a language entirely based on emojis.
Nice. So I kind of want to move us along to if people want to use this. So I'm using this project, or I'm writing my code in TypeScript, and I'm like, oh yeah, it'd be nice to lint my TypeScript code. How well do you play with some of the frameworks that either highly encourage or mandate that you use TypeScript? Do you get into some of the sort of semantic or conventional ways of writing TypeScript there and make it all conform with the React way or the Angular way or the Vue way?
I think we work pretty well with them. I've actually been off and on trying to work with some of the bigger React or front end frameworks to get them to recommend using TypeScript ESLint recommended rather than having not that. For example, Create Next App doesn't do as much around us as I wish it
Create
would.
Next App is kind of
Mhm.
deprecated, I think.
Oh, well, that explains that.
Well, behind the times there, Josh.
Oof. Yeah, I love Next.js. It's so stable. I sure hope they don't change how we write pages. I'm a big
But
Next.js
don't
user.
you
I feel
know,
comfortable teasing
Next.js
them.
is the future of React. Vercel even said so themselves.
Great. I'll come back on. We'll have a full discussion about server components. It'll be great. But
We
yeah,
had one.
Next.js comp coming up.
We had one. We had Dan Abramov on the show a while back. A double header, like a 2 episode. It was such a long discussion. It came out as 2 episodes. I highly recommend it. By the way, it was a really good discussion.
It was in the spring of this year, right? April,
Something like that.
But yeah, we work well with other frameworks because we generally only have rules. Actually, we explicitly only have rules that are core to pretty much virtually all TypeScript users. We don't get into
Okay.
situations where we recommend something that's bad, let's say, with a specific framework. And actually, speaking of server components in React, there is one case where we're starting to get into a little bit of a, not conflict, but a mismatch, which is that some Next.js APIs require that you define your functions as asynchronous or returning a promise in the TypeScript types, even though the functions actually don't really need to be async. And we have a rule that says if a function is async, it better do something asynchronous. Otherwise, that's an unnecessary async.
But
Interesting.
it goes beyond that. I mean, if you have use server or use client at the top of a Next.js React file, it kind of changes the semantics of things that are allowed or not allowed in the file. It's even not just a TypeScript ESLint problem, it's an ESLint problem, I would think.
It changes the runtime behavior and what you're allowed to do, which therefore changes what some lint rules might care about. For example, the React specific lint rules. But it doesn't change how one might generate type information for a file. So I'm knocking on every single piece of wood near me in my room right now. It hasn't impacted us yet, and I hope it doesn't.
So,
But
you
said, oh, sorry, just that you
Yeah,
made
go.
that quick note before that if you're creating, let's say, server functions, they have to be async, I think, async or something like that, even though they are not actually, they're seemingly not actually used as async functions or stuff like that.
I don't remember exactly which parts of Next.js this applies to. I believe this is a Next.js specific thing. It's not a React specific thing. So I want to say it's get server-side props. Forgive me. I've been too deep into the Astro space lately, so I forget some of these things. But this is not a React thing.
I'll give a different example, though. You've got server dollar, both in solid and in quick. In solid, functions wrapped inside server dollar have to be async. In quick, they don't. If you're trying to create ESLint rules that work across all these frameworks, you might actually need to have different rules for different frameworks.
Sure. At that point, if there was a framework-specific best practice or even necessary practice, they can either put it into the TypeScript type definitions, if that is in fact something that's type system enforceable, such as if a particular API needs to take a promise that returns, needs to take a function that returns promise, not function that returns anything else, then they can say that. And or they could create their own ESLint plugin, like ESLint plugin solid or ESLint plugin React. But for us, we just enforce things that are common to all JavaScript. We don't care what the framework best practices are. If the framework is asking you to do something that's silly or unnecessary or just plain bug ridden in a way that is obvious in the JavaScript syntax or TypeScript types, then we get into conflict. But these frameworks are written by teams that do a lot of research. So we have yet to see this actually be an issue for the most part.
So if I then get into something and let's say React wants me to format things in a specific way, right? And maybe I'm coming from Angular where they, the kind of the way people do things there are a little bit different, but they're all syntactic, your linter is going to be fine with it either way. But yeah, it's just not the way people write code in that particular community. Then those people would just have another plugin that goes on top of TypeScript ESLint that is the Angular TypeScript ESLint and says, hey, we format our classes or whatever this way, and we add our properties this way, and since it's all happy, valid, not bug causing TypeScript, then yeah, I can have my linter on top of yours that isn't going to collide or conflict.
Yeah. Fun fact about Angular ESLint, by the way, that's the name of the project that's Angular.
Oh, there
ESLint.
is one. Okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't
and
shock me.
Yeah. And one of its core maintainers, if it's not one, I forget how many they have, James Henry is also a core maintainer and actually the creator of TypeScript ESLint. So traditionally, we've worked pretty well with the Angular side.
Well,
Right.
Angular was one of the first frameworks to actually
Yep.
embrace TypeScript, as I recall.
Yeah. They were trying to do their own script, and then there were reasons, but they switched. And it's been interesting to watch. So, yeah. But they fully embraced TypeScript, and I think it's worked well for people who have been writing it.
So we kind of stopped you halfway. You mentioned that you've got 6 configurations, and and we only gone through 4. So we had the can you go back through the ones you already
Sure.
mentioned and then proceed to the last 2?
Yes, the last 2 are my favorites, the juiciest. We have recommended and stylistic. That's the x-axis of 2. And then we have the y-axis of whether it's the regular one or the super fancy superset type checked one. We then also have a lot of rules that are really powerful and often, but not always because of type information, but are a little too strict for everyone. They're nice. I personally use them, but people who onboard to us in the past have experienced pain from just 50 million of these rules complaining. So we have it's a legitimate
this
user
happens
pain,
to everybody. They come in and they turn on a linter and they're like, oh man.
Yeah, I love those builds that have like a million warning messages, and everybody just you ask one of the developers, oh, we just ignore these.
Yeah.
You're training developers to ignore the linter. What could possibly go wrong? So we split out the rules that are a little more nitpicky or a little bit less easy to demonstrate immediate value from into configs, a regular version and a type check version called strict. So we have 2 config groups, each of which have a regular and a type check version. And an example of a strict rule is await nettable, because it's not immediately obvious sometimes how to fix it. So it's great. We recommend it, but not everyone would want to use it to start.
Now it's pretty easy to get going with it, right? You just yarn install it and
give or take.
No.
It's straightforward. You tell your ESLint config that your parser is now our parser. Then you can also extend from our recommended rule set in addition to the core ESLint rule set or whatever else you were doing. And that's basically it for the regular ones. For type information, you should also say the parser options object has a project property saying either true for just find the closest tsconfig type configuration file for each file, or a specific string or array of strings, that's the path or clubs. That gets a little more hairy sometimes. For most small to medium-sized projects, yeah, it's straightforward, it's fine. For bigger ones where performance of type checking becomes a real concern, then there are some things you might have to do. And we actually have I think, really exciting experimental flag about using more optimized TypeScript APIs called the project service that I'm hoping to land in core stable within the next year. But yeah, for the most part, it's straightforward.
So is building speed a real concern? We talked about the caching problems that arise with TypeScript, with linting TypeScript.
It is, yeah. In theory, your typed lint should only ever be slightly slower than your type check, your TSC run, because most of the work is running type information. ESLint itself is actually quite fast. That's one of the reasons why a Rust alternative to ESLint has yet to really get popular enough to overtake ESLint. It's not really an issue. But then type checking, especially if you misconfigure it or have some weird performance shenanigans with your types, which is possible annoyingly, then there gets more pain there. But I'm hoping, like, one of my big goals for joining the TypeScript ESLint crew is that I don't want there to be any major, roadblocks or pain points that a lot of people hit. And this is the last of the really big ones that I want to tackle while I'm here.
The performance issue?
Yeah. That so for context, right now we use some TypeScript APIs that allow us to manually instantiate what's called a project. That's the TypeScript representation of one of your TS configs or projects in code. And because we do that manually, it's sometimes a little difficult to fine-tune things for performance. For example, if you use TypeScript project references, then we have to do a lot of work and we don't actually fully support that. TypeScript has an API called the project service, which takes on much more of the work for generating projects and is actually what editors like VS Code use. So if we were to switch to the project service or give users the option to, we in our experiments have seen that you can get up to significant performance improvements. I think it's like up to 50% faster or 30%, some
wow.
large number. But it's a little buggy. So not ready, but very exciting.
So you're not thinking about rewriting everything in Rust or something?
No. First of all, although I actually learned C++ back in college, I don't particularly want to work in that low level of a language, even though Rust is beautiful. I know we said all languages are beautiful, but Rust is beautiful. It's just not my core competency right now. Take some time. But also because the TypeScript type checker is not yet available at Rust speeds or lower optimized language speeds. It's only written in TypeScript right now. And the closest project to recreate it in Rust, called STC, very, very exciting, very cool project, is nowhere near production ready on our timelines. So any linter written in Rust or Zig or Go or whatnot would have to either re-implement all of TypeScript, good luck with that, or suffer the performance penalty of calling to code that executes in JavaScript land. And that's why it hasn't happened yet.
Awesome. So is there anything else we should know about TypeScript ESLint?
Whew. Well, I'd say for anyone who hasn't overhauled their ESLint config in the last year, go through our docs. I highly recommend it. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I also recommend there's a great repo called Awesome ESLint, dspecker/Awesome ESLint, that has a giant list of really great ESLint plugins. One that I'd love to shout out is the deprecation plugin, which lets you know if you call to some method or use something in code that's marked with the JSDog at deprecated. I'd say ESLint or linting in general is not the only thing that one could do to make code good. I've been really into this tool lately called Knip that finds unused code in a way that's actually not really doable in a linter. Yeah, it's shocking sometimes the things you find with unused code detection. So I'd say take a look at your whole dev process and see linting, testing, type information, unused, etc. What parts of it haven't you looked at in a while?
So that would be something like a post CSS for CSS, where you're going through and getting one of the things you can do where you can go and get rid of code that's not being used.
Yeah, but it's really powerful. Like it'll find interfaces that are, let's say, exported from a file and never used, or dependencies that you declare in your package JSON and never use, or dependencies that you don't declare in your package JSON but then do refer to.
Yeah, so I
that's
just
exciting.
found an article about it on Smashing Magazine. Knip, an automated tool for finding unused files, exports, and dependencies.
Yep, that's the one.
Awesome.
Lastly, I don't know if this will bring up a whole sub-conversation. I'm sorry if so, but we, TypeScript ESLint, are an independent open source project. We're not sponsored by any major company. Primarily, we are a bunch of randos on the internet. We're also separate from ESLint. So if anyone wants to contribute to us, whether that is time or money, we really appreciate that.
Good deal.
That's all.
All right. Well, I'm going to push us to picks. Dan, do you want to go first?
I'll try. This is not fun times in Israel, to say the least, but I'm intentionally going to mostly avoid this. Also, just mention something at the very end about it. But I'll try to actually talk about more fun things. So, one thing I really wanted to shout out is this TypeScript Origins, the documentary video that recently came out on OfferZen channel. I've only watched it halfway, but it's really good. Really good. It's kind of reminiscent of the um, documentary about Svelte that came out, and also about React. Those documentaries that came out some months ago. So this one is also really good, and I recommend watching it. Like I said, I only watched about half, but the half that I watched was really, really interesting. Um, some unexpected twists and turns along the way. So, um, it turns out, at least the way that they put it, that TypeScript was kind of the thing, like the first major open source project that Microsoft ever did, which is really interesting. And they were really kind of, it was one of the signals of the changing of the guards from Ballmer to Satya Nadella, that they could actually even do TypeScript. So it's a really interesting story. So that's one pick that I want to mention. Another one is on the Programmers Are Also Human channel. They recently released a really, really funny video. These are the same guys that created the interview with a senior JavaScript developer, which was hilarious. So they now introduced an interview with a senior Rust developer in 2023, which is also absolutely hilarious. And I highly recommend watching it. It's so funny. I'm not going to try to repeat any of the jokes because I'm just going to ruin them. And just watch it, and it's great. I did say that I will mention something about Israel. So what I will mention is that President Zelensky of Ukraine actually came out with a video supporting Israel in its hour of need, and also actual people in the Ukrainian army fighting in Ukraine also came out with supportive videos for Israel. And that's unfortunately a lot more support than the Israeli leadership has shown to Ukraine. So it's kind of really puts us to shame. I want to say that I'm really grateful for the Ukrainian people for their support, and I'm, as almost on every show, calling for other, the people of the world to support the people of Ukraine in their hour of need. And those would be my picks for today.
All right, Steve, what are your picks?
Well, let's see. First thing is I'm going to second a pick. A couple of weeks ago, AJ had mentioned the movie Gran Turismo. That it was really good, and so I took my son to see it, and we loved it. Really good movie, apparently based on a true story. Did a little reading about it. About short version is Nissan was looking for ways to get some drivers, and they had a Gran Turismo simulation game. It really involved simulation game, and they picked some of the fastest racers from the game, took them to this academy, taught them how to really race actual cars, and then took one and had them out driving, and that's the main character.
Isn't
So
that kind of the script of the last Starfighter movie from the
yes,
80s?
exactly.
Kind of.
Well,
Also,
that
Ender's
one
Game?
that one was based on the arcade game. I guess it was called The Last Starfighter.
Yeah.
That was a great movie. I still remember that one.
Yep. I watched
Anyway,
that with my kids.
yeah, and I'd forgotten about that movie. Anyway, and then after that, we liked it so much that we went back and watched Ford versus Ferrari too, which is another.
Oh,
I thought
that's
was a
another
very
great
good
one.
That's a
movie.
good one.
Yeah.
With Christian Bale and Matt Damon, for sure. That was a great story. So anyway, good job, AJ. That was a good pick. And now for the highlight, the dad jokes of the week. So recently, I heard a story about a ship carrying blue paint that collided with a ship carrying red paint, and 50 sailors were marooned.
Okay, that's a good
That
one.
one was pretty close to funny.
Yes.
That's pretty good.
I'm in my spare time, which I have a lot. I'm writing a book about all the things I should be doing in my life. It's my autobiography, right? And then this one's sort of a tongue twister, so I have to say it slow. I asked my son the other day, I said, what do you call a bunch of indifferent pumpkins grown on a hill in Norway? And he didn't know, so I said, a horde of bored fjord gourds. And he was floored, by the way. So those are my picks.
All right. I'm going to jump in with a handful of picks here. I usually do a board game pick. I'm not going to do that this week just because I've been traveling all week and I'm not thinking of one that I'm just like, oh, I should pick this one again. So let me kind of move into some of the other stuff. So I mentioned last week I did the Rails World in Amsterdam, and it was such a good trip. A couple of things that I did that I'm going to shout out about. The first one is I went to the Anne Frank house. I hadn't been able to get into it before.
No,
It
the
turns
line
out
can be terrible there.
you have to reserve your spot, and if you don't buy a ticket in advance, you can't go. So I paid for a ticket. I found out when they open up the tickets, which is on Tuesdays, and I think it's like 6 weeks in advance. So literally Tuesday, 6 weeks in advance, I got on and made sure I had a ticket. And it's in the building where they hid, right? It's not where they were living, it's where they hid. And so you kind of go through and they explain the whole Nazi occupation, and then you actually get to walk through the space that they hid in. And boy, if that doesn't make you really think about how lucky you are to be where you are, right? Anyway, if you have a chance to go, it's pretty amazing.
I'll
Um,
interrupt you for a second because I can't help myself. Some
okay.
of the stories, unfortunately, it's incredibly sad and quite unsettling. Some of the stories coming out of what happened in southern Israel are reminiscent of that,
Mm-hmm.
of
Yes.
people hiding in their houses, trying to quiet their babies while terrorists were roaming the street and literally hunting for people.
Mm-hmm.
And people were some people survived by managing to hide, and many didn't. So yeah, that story is very reminiscent of what
Yep.
just happened in Israel, which is shocking.
Yep. Absolutely. And some of the videos that are coming out of Israel are they're really hard to watch. If you're sensitive to any of that, don't watch them. Um, I kind of wanted to get a feel for what was going on, and so anyway, they are. It's really terrible what was going on down there, and yeah, they were going house to house, and anyway, I don't want to go too deep into it because yeah, I don't want to take this in a dark direction, but be aware of the kinds of things that are going on there for sure. Um, but yeah, so also in Amsterdam, one of the other things I did is I went out to another city that's about a half hour away from Amsterdam called Leiden. And Leiden is a city, they had a little bit more Enlightenment thinkers back in the 1600s, and that's why the American Pilgrims went there before they came back and went back to England to get on the Mayflower. And the only reason they went back to England to get on the Mayflower at all was that the king granted them a charter and basically gave them free passage because they were criminals for their wrongthink in England, and so they had left England. That's why they left. But he granted them the charter to go settle in the New World, and so they could travel through England and were granted safe passage to get on the ships. And then one of the ships had trouble and had to turn around. But anyway, I went out there and just kind of wandered through the city. Now, there's not a whole lot there that was there in the 1600s. It's a fairly modern city. There is a museum for the American pilgrims there. It's really just one room and it has time period artifacts. But it was really interesting just to kind of hear him talking about, some of the things that I learned about in school, and I think in some cases I knew more about some parts of the story than they did, but it was really, really interesting to kind of get a perspective, in Leiden, which is where they were living until they got that charter and went back through England to get on the Mayflower. And incidentally, I have 3 ancestors that came over on the Mayflower. So
Wow.
Wow.
it
Yo,
was kind
royalty,
of,
Chuck.
well, I don't know about that. They were poor people, and half of them died when they got here. But um, kind of what we're seeing in Ukraine and Israel, and um, it's this same desire to just be free and live the way that we, desire to live and have those opportunities. Anyway, it's really kind of been hitting home for me lately, how fortunate I am because some people were willing to sacrifice, to take the chance to take 2 months to come across the ocean. And then even then it was, it was in Massachusetts in the winter. The only real shelter they had was the boat that they had come over on. And some of it's miraculous, the way that it all worked out. But um anyway, so I kind of had those two things go on. And then more on the code front, I was there for Rails World, as I mentioned. Really had a good time looking into Hotwire and some of the things that they're doing with Rails to kind of enable some of this stuff with stimulus. And so yeah, I'm getting a little bit more into that. I'd really love to, do an episode one of these days and just talk about, Hotwire and Stimulus and the way that Rails handles some of the front end assets that we don't really talk about in some of the other circles that we move in. And then somebody mentioned the React documentary. They did a Rails documentary, the same people that did the React documentary,
Oh
and they
yeah,
released it
cool.
at Rails World.
I'll watch it. That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
I didn't
yeah,
know that.
and
Thank you.
I believe there's a
the
one for Vue as well that's been around for a couple of years.
it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know if they're all done by the same people. It looked like the Svelte one was done by other folks, but because I looked that one up too. But anyway, they released it because it was the 20th anniversary of Rails coming out. So anyway,
So
fun stuff.
DHH is not a kid anymore.
Nope. DHH is actually like 6 months older than I am. So go figure. Anyway, so those are my picks. Sorry, I went a little bit dark on one of them, but anyway, Josh, what are your picks?
Oh boy. I've been taking notes on subjects. I wasn't expecting to give a movie recommendation, but one of my favorite movies that I was reminded of recently is Drive with Ryan Gosling. It was
Hmm.
marketed as like this action thriller thing, but it's really
Yeah.
more of like a psychological drama suspense film. And it's this beautiful contemplation on the beauty of humanity and human nature and being kind versus evil to each other. Also, Ryan Gosling kills a guy in an elevator. So beautiful, beautiful movie, great soundtrack, highly recommend.
Nice.
Yeah. I was recently at 3 conferences in order. JSJ IE, which I believe is soon to be renamed to JSConf IE, React Live in Amsterdam just before you were there, and
Mhm.
Revo.js in Timișoara, Romania. They were all great. I believe the JSJ IE videos are up on YouTube now. I think what's freshest in my mind is the Timișoara trip. We also went on this whole full day hangout excursion into Romanian village where we had this platter of traditional foods and soika and rakia and all this amazing stuff. But we went on this horse-drawn carriage through the city, or pardon me, the village, and it was an amazing time and highly recommend. It's only their second conference, but they organized it, the Revo.js team, incredibly well.
Romania is indeed a lovely country. You do need to take into account that it's pretty huge. So,
Yeah.
getting around, plan on driving quite a bit. Not as big as the States, obviously, but it's pretty
Mhm.
big.
Yeah, they were saying that they were taking, multiple hour or multiple leg flights to get from, say, East Romania to where we were in the West. Would have been 15-hour driving for them. But it also served to remind me, sorry to again go a little darker, that this is like many in the region, a post-Soviet country, and many of the people there remember the Soviet Union or having relatives or friends disappeared. So
They had
I don't.
Ceausescu, who was a pretty horrific despot, ruling there
Oh, he
for
was
many,
awful.
many, many years.
Yeah. I don't have anything salient to say on the matter, as I'm not an expert and I don't know what I could say, but I will echo what's been said so far about freedom and the the ability to live.
All right. Well, thanks for coming, Josh. This was a lot of fun. If people want to connect with you online, what are the best places to find you?
Well, they could not do that, but otherwise, my username my username everywhere is Joshua K Goldberg. K as in kite, or Kevin, my middle name. I would encourage anyone to reach out and chat with me. I'm always happy to talk open source or TypeScript or whatnot. And that's Joshua K Goldberg. It's on my website.com, Twitch, Twitter, YouTube. My Mastodon server is
Oh, you do
Fastodon,
stuff on
Blue
Twitch?
Sky. Oh yeah, I should mention I
Yeah.
stream code twice a week on Twitch when I'm not traveling for conferences. So my first stream in a little bit will be tomorrow at time of recording.
So you stream live coding sessions?
Yeah. Coding is one of the things I do. It's open source in general, and honestly, a lot of it ends up being going through issues and pull requests.
Something I can never figure out how a person does. I mean, I would feel so. I'm trying to find the phrasing. Self-conscious, I
Yes.
guess, trying to streaming myself as I'm coding. One of my issues even doing pair programming is how self-conscious I get when somebody looks over my shoulder while I code. So I'm struggling with the concept.
Yeah, you see how much time developers spend Googling things
Yeah.
basically
I
things
don't
they've
care
forgotten how
about
to do.
that. It's just I don't know. It's just it like for me, coding is kind of a private thing, I guess.
I started coding in part as a private thing in the same way that I play video games privately. I don't like multiplayer. I'm there to enjoy myself, to build something, to really think and do it right. But I will say many different people do or don't get into live streaming or pairing. It's not something everyone has to do. One of the ways that people do to get into it that was effective for me, your mileage may vary, was I started trying to intentionally view it as a way to get feedback. That I'm not just very self-conscious and nervous, but also very neurotic that, oh my gosh, I must be doing it wrong. Everyone else knows things better. So I started pairing at work, even doing Bob sessions with the explicit intention of everyone yell at me so I can do better. And then I took that mentality to Twitch. And now it's also beneficial because a lot of people don't know what it's like to be an open source and don't understand why their issue with no reproduction and swear words is not going over well. So between those two things, it's very useful for me, I think, to live code.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thanks for coming, Josh. Till next time, Max out.